I'm Carrie Healy, president of Babson College, and as some of you may remember, the former lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, but most importantly, today I'm here as a director of the Pioneer Institute. The work, research, and advocacy being done at the Pioneer Institute alongside our partners continues to have a nationwide impact on the key educational and economic issues facing our state and our nation, and we appreciate and are very thankful for all of your continued support for this work. And we're particularly thankful that you decided to come out and join us this afternoon to enjoy this incredibly interesting panel. We've got a terrific program today, and like all of you, I'm really looking forward to hearing from our special guests. First, I'd like to take a moment, however, to thank and acknowledge our numerous co-sponsors for today, all of whom have been very generous. First and foremost, of course, the Pioneer Institute, but also the Program on Education Policy and Governance at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School, the Concord Review, We the People, the Citizen and the Constitution, Citizenship First, Citizen Schools, the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts. If we could all just give them all a round of applause, please. Thank you very much. You can be sure that an event that brings together such influential co-sponsors is going to deliver topics, insights, and opinions that will teach us things we didn't know and leave us with a better understanding of where we've been and, more importantly, where we need to go in the future. March is Women's History Month, and today's program appropriately features an all-female lineup in the great tradition of principled, impassioned, and pragmatic women who have left their mark on this state's and our nation's history and literature. So much U.S. history is also Massachusetts history, and I believe we have a unique and special responsibility to be the strongest advocates for the continued study and celebration of our history and literary traditions, which continue to shape our values and our ideals today. Consider for a moment the contributions to our nation's history by just a few of Massachusetts's most prominent women. Our nation's first Second Lady and second First Lady and presidential confidant Abigail Adams from Weymouth and Quincy, poet Emily Dickinson from Amherst, Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Edith Wharton, who lived in Lenox, American revolutionary political writer and propagandist Mercy Otis Warren from Barnstable, abolitionist and social radical Abby Kelly Foster, who was born in Uxbridge and dedicated her life to ending slavery and full civil rights for African Americans. Those are just a few of the amazing women who are from Massachusetts. I think they deserve a round of applause. Through these examples and so many others, we learn and are taught and better understand the rich and complex history of the United States. Unfortunately, today in our public schools, the teaching of history has largely become an afterthought instead of being a durable, appreciated, and important part of public education. Massachusetts, unfortunately, has not done enough to keep history alive in our classrooms. For example, the history test has not been included as part of the MCAS exam since 2009. Our concern is if history is not tested, it will not be taught, and to the great disservice of our students and to the detriment of our society as a whole. So I ask you to join us as advocates for the restoration of the U.S. history component of the MCAS exam as a key pillar of public education here in Massachusetts. As the cradle of liberty, Massachusetts has a unique responsibility to ensure our history and the lessons drawn from it are not lost. And we're so fortunate to have with us today some incredible women who are doing their part to protect our national story. Now it is my pleasure to welcome today's keynote speakers, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce first Cokie Roberts. Cokie is a contributor to National Public Radio's Morning Edition and political commentator for ABC News and former co-host of This Week. A 3-time Emmy Award winner, she is a member of the Broadcasting and Cable Hall of Fame and honored as one of the 50 greatest women in broadcasting by the American Women in Radio and Television. Ms. Roberts' Histories of Women in America's Founding Era, Founding Mothers, published in 2004, and Ladies of Liberty in 2008, were instant New York Times bestsellers. At this time, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Cokie Roberts.
Thank you. Well, what a treat to be with all of you. I must say I've never been with so many people with citizen before their names. It's a good thing, it's like the French Revolution. Really, it is always nice when March comes around. We get our 1 month, and I'll take it. I'm glad to get one. But I particularly like it because it gives me the opportunity to talk about these women, and I do love talking about them because they are a great group. I first got interested in writing about women of the founding era because of my work covering politics. I've covered politics and government for decades, more decades than I would care to cite, and as such, you have to go back all the time and read what the Founding Fathers had to say about the right to bear arms or religion in the public square. This week is a big one for that. All kinds of things. And by the way, they are cited, these poor men. I mean, I have a lot of fights to pick with the Founding Fathers, but but I really do feel for them in that they are misrepresented so often. People in the Senate in particular, the founders said, no, they didn't. And, they're just wrong pretty much 99% of the time. But because I had spent so much time with them, I got curiouser and curiouser about what the women were up to at this very essential period in our history. And I grew up in American politics. My father was elected to Congress in 1940 before I was born. And I saw my mother and all of her cronies being just incredibly influential in the Washington of the 1940s and 50s, where they ran everything. They ran all the voter registration drives, the political conventions, their husbands' campaigns, of course, us kids. And they ran, along with the African-American women in Washington, the social service agencies. So I knew how influential they were. And I figured women in this earlier period had to be at least as influential. My own mother then actually did go on. My father was lost in a plane that was never found. It's been a rough couple of weeks. But, and she was then elected to Congress and served 9 terms. So she was very interesting about the differences of influence on the scene and behind the scenes. And then she retired and discovered that was really hard work. And so she, at the age of 81, in 1997, she took a new job in a new country as the United States ambassador to the Vatican. And we were all thrilled. We said, this is great. She'll get to have a capstone on a career in public service where she can serve both her country and her church. And we'll get to go to Rome all the time, which, is always a good thing. And then what happened in this country happened. And my mother found herself representing Bill Clinton to the Pope. Think of it, toughest job in the diplomatic service, but anybody could do it, Mama could. She then went home to New Orleans, where her home was on Bourbon Street. And I mean right smack dab in the middle of all the honky-tonk on Bourbon Street, not out someplace, In fact, when my children were small, we'd walk past the strippers and the other neighbors, and I'd say, through the woods and over the hills to grandmother's house we go. And then she moved from Bourbon Street to the Vatican, and I teased her that the costumes didn't change. It was still men in dresses, but But we just lost her last summer at age 97, and she was going very strong until the end. And she was a great believer in the role of history. And she had been a history teacher briefly as a straight out of college 19-year-old. And her students were older than she was. And she was chairman of the Bicentennial of Congress and the Bicentennial of the Constitution and all of those things. So her devotion to history was enormous, and it was something that she imparted to all of us. But as I started to think about these women and wonder more what their stories were, I realized I really knew nothing. I mean, I knew about Martha Washington at Valley Forge. And by the way, I've been speaking to school groups because this wonderful children's version of Founding Mothers just came out, and it's fabulously, fabulously illustrated. But I've been talking to these school groups, and they don't know about Valley Forge either. Maybe they do in Pennsylvania, but they don't the rest of the country. But I did know that. I knew Martha spent a winter at Valley Forge, and I knew Dolly had saved George Washington's portrait. And that's pretty much all I knew. And then growing up, then in the 70s with the resurgence of the feminist movement, we all passed around Abigail's admonition to remember the ladies. But that was pretty much the sum total of my knowledge. And so I went back to read about these women, and I couldn't. With the exception of a couple of good biographies of Abigail Adams, there wasn't anything. And so it was clear why I didn't know anything. Nothing had been written. And so it then became my job to write it, which is harder than just learning about them. But it turned out to be very, very worthwhile and interesting because they are such terrific people. I discovered, of course, that Martha Washington not only spent the winter at Valley Forge, but she spent every winter of the 8 long years of the Revolutionary War at camp with the soldiers, and she hated it. She was frightened. It was unpleasant. It was uncomfortable. She had to go over terrible roads to get to any place she was going, and she was a prime target for hostage taking. And the British did take Patriot wives hostage, some and killed some. And she, of course, was the wife of the chief patriot, and so she was nervous about it. But she went every single winter to camp because the general, as she called him, asked her to come. And he felt that it was absolutely essential for her to be there because there were so many times in the course of the war that the soldiers were so ill-housed, clothed, paid, fed, that they were threatening desertion by regiment. And she would come into camp bringing with her foodstuffs that had been preserved over the summer at Mount Vernon, cloth that had been woven, one of the many, many contributions of African Americans to the revolutionary cause. And she'd be cheered into camp. Lady Washington is here. And she would then organize the other officers' wives, and they would cook for the soldiers and sew for the soldiers and pray with the soldiers and nurse the soldiers and put on great entertainments for them. So it really boosted morale and kept them in the army. And that was absolutely essential for the American cause. David McCulloch writes that George Washington's great genius was keeping the army together, but George would say he couldn't do it without Martha. And so she did go every year, despite the fact that she found it very difficult. I must say the winter at Valley Forge, the person that we as Americans really should be most grateful to, however, is not one of the Patriot wives who was freezing and starving at Valley Forge along with the soldiers, but a woman in Philadelphia. The British had occupied Philadelphia, and they could have picked up at any moment and just marched out to Valley Forge, it's right there, and destroyed the freezing, starving Continental Army. But they were having way too good a time in Philadelphia with the Loyalist women. And there was one woman in particular, Betsy Loring, who had attracted the attentions of the British commander, Sir William Howe. And everybody knew it. You know, there were little ditties in the newspaper. Sir William he, snug as a flea, lay all the time a-snoring, nor dreamed of harm as he lay warm in bed with Mrs. Loring. So that didn't make it into the children's book. But I would love to be able to say that Mrs. Loring was a patriot. She was not. She got a good job for her husband in the British Army, and maybe she likes Sir William. I mean, I don't have any way of knowing that. But so many of these women were incredible patriots. And one of the things that really struck me as I started to do the work was how explicitly they had been called upon to be political and to be patriots. And of course, in the whole lead up to the war, with the British, imposing taxes and all of that, the boycott was the weapon of choice, and the women were called upon to enforce the boycott and then to replace the goods that were not coming in as a result of it. And so they'd set up spinning bees and usually parsons' parlors up and down the colonies, and they would spin and they would gossip and they would talk politics. And it really did strike me how deeply, deeply political their letters, to the extent that we have them, are, and what great patriots they were. Abigail Adams at one point wrote to John that women were really better patriots than the men. She said, patriotism in the female breast is the least self-interested of virtues. And she said, because, you men, if we win, here we are suffering all the hardships, making all the sacrifices for the cause. And if we win, you men will be held in high acclaim and hold office, and we won't even be able to vote. So we are better patriots than you are. John did have, sense enough to pay attention on that one, unlike when she had been after him for a full year. Because, remember, Lexington and Concord happened in 1775. And so for a year, she had been saying, for heaven's sakes, declare independence. What's wrong with you men? And the British are awful. I went to church today, and the preacher called for reconciliation. I'm not reconciling with those people. And meanwhile, John's off in Philadelphia, and the British are here. And as John Quincy Adams wrote years later, the children actually love this. He wrote, there we were for the space of 12 months. My mother with her infant children dwelt liable every hour of the day and night to be butchered in cold blood or taken and carried to Boston as hostages. And John finally says to her, if it gets really dangerous, take our children and fly to the woods. Thank you, John. Hope you're having a nice dinner in Philadelphia, But she just said, danger, they say, makes one valiant. I must say I'm so grateful to the Massachusetts Historical Society because all of these letters are online between John and Abigail Adams. And John Quincy Adams' diary, which he kept every day from the time he was a little boy, is online in his handwriting and searchable by date. So it's very, very useful. But as they finally get to the point where it looks like they're going to be declaring independence, she then did say, you're going to have a new code of laws, and when you do, remember the ladies, because all men would be tyrants if they could. And he laughed at her. He did. He did one of those classic male put-downs of, oh, you women really have all the power. Of course, they had no political power and no legal power. Married women were the property of their husbands. And I think that's probably what she was talking about, in fact, was legal power. But she was not, some people think she was kidding. She was not kidding. She wrote a letter to Mercy Otis Warren, who you just heard Dr. Healy talk about, saying, I've said to them that we should do this. And Mercy never answered her because she didn't want to get on the wrong side of the men. She was always interested in staying on the right side of the men. But Mercy Otis Warren's writings were incredibly important as a propagandist. You know, she was the Fox News or MSNBC of the day, where she was riling people up against the British, and the men were asking her, write more, tell them how terrible they are. And she was happy to do that. When war finally was declared, Washington comes and sets up his first camp here in Cambridge. The British are in Boston. And the troops, such as they were, the militias from various places, were in the Harvard dorms. And they haven't gotten much better since. And and everybody wanted to come see him, right? You know, the generals, see what he looks like, and Lady Washington. And Mercy Otis Warren did go and visit with them. And she wrote to John Adams that Washington was very amiable. And then she said, but General Lee was marked by ugliness and impoliteness. And I just love it because, you know, reading her mail 200 years later, she didn't expect us to know that that's what she thought. And I tell the kids it's really okay to read the women's mail because they're dead. And they've been dead a long time. And we're very grateful to them for having left mail. So few did. And that's one of the real challenges in writing women's history, particularly 18th century history. I'm working now on a Civil War book where it is much easier. Now we have our colleague, Catherine Clinton, who you're going to hear, came all the way from Ireland to see you all today. And she has written a couple of wonderful Civil War biographies, Harriet Tubman and Mary Lincoln. But she even kind of likes Mary Lincoln, which is tough. But somebody's got to do it, right? But in the 17th century and early 18th century and early 19th century, many of their letters were destroyed. Now, some of them destroyed their own. We believe that Martha Washington destroyed her correspondence with George. We know Thomas Jefferson destroyed his correspondence with his wife, Martha. Saying that he was heartbroken and couldn't keep it after she died. I personally don't think that's the way you behave when you're heartbroken, but it's his story and he's sticking to it. And then descendants just didn't care. You know, they didn't save them. So we are very constrained in what we know and what we can write because of the absence of a lot of those papers. In fact, I just learned just the other day that Bess Truman destroyed all of her correspondence with Harry Truman. I know. And he found her doing it. And he said, Bess, how can you do this? Think of history. And she said, I am. So there is that. But, you know, while Washington was here in Cambridge, the one person he really wanted to see was Phyllis Wheatley, the slave poet, and because she was famous. And it's really remarkable, you know, she came, and the children do seem to know more about her than anybody else. So the schools are getting word out on Phyllis Wheatley. She came to Boston. Of course, so many people don't even realize that slavery, the sin of slavery, was legal in all the colonies before the war. And she was probably 7 or 8 years old, something that's estimated because she still had her baby teeth, and went to work for the Wheatley family. They quickly discovered how smart she was, and the teenagers in the family taught her to read and write and taught her the Bible, and then she could read everything and did read everything and started writing poetry as a teenager herself, and it started getting published in the newspapers, but she tried to get a book published and nobody would publish it. So all the important men of Boston wrote letters endorsing her and sent the letters and the poems off to London, where the book was published, and she became an overnight celebrity, this slave teenage girl. And the Wheatleys finally gave her freedom. But so Washington wanted to meet her because he had heard of her. And she did go and visit with him at camp. But it is, again, one of the ways that we know, of course, about her is that we have her poetry. It's not all that accessible in terms of the style, but we actually have the words. And of course, the other way that we know about people from any period is through government records or through privately held records. And the person who I thought was just fascinating, who I had never heard of, whose records we had, was Esther Read. And Esther Read was an English woman. She fell in love with an American who had come over to study law in London and moved to this country. She was horrified by the state of women's education in this country. And she quickly became a huge patriot. She, too, was arguing for independence a full year before the men got around to it. And in 1780, it looked like we were going to lose the war. You know, the British were occupying New York and Charleston. The French had not yet arrived. And so she decided that she would put on a fundraising drive for the troops. She was the First Lady of Pennsylvania. And she organized all the women in Philadelphia. She wrote the sentiments of an American woman and had them published in the newspaper in Philadelphia and picked up in newspapers around the country, calling on women to make sacrifices for the soldiers. And then she organized the women in Philadelphia, and they went 2 by 2, door to door, and raised money. And we have all those records. So we know who went where and how much they raised and all that. So it's, it's record keeping. And in the space of just a few weeks, they raised $300,000, which was not like some phony 1780 money. It was real money. And to give you a comparison, at the same time, Robert Morris was trying to capitalize a national bank, and in the course of months had only been able to get $380,000 in capital. So this was a huge amount of money. And by the way, the only extant letter of Martha Jefferson's that we have, she was First Lady of Virginia. And Esther Read asked all the other First Ladies to do fundraising drives in their states. So we have Martha Jefferson's letter to the women of Virginia, asking them to bring money to the churches because it was impractical to go door to door. And so Esther wanted to use the money to do something special for the soldiers, to show them how appreciated they were. So she wanted to give them hard currency, and Washington had a fit and said, "Are you crazy? They'll drink it, and they'll expect hard currency all the time, and they don't get that." And so she went back and forth with him about how to use the money. And he kept saying, shirts, what they need is shirts. And she kept saying, but you're supposed to give them shirts. We want to give them something special. And we do have all this correspondence. Well, she died. She was in her 30s. She had 5 or 6 kids living. And, some disease came through, as they did. I mean, living in the 18th century was not easy. And she died, so Washington won. And so they made shirts. And Sarah Franklin, Benjamin's daughter, took over. And one of the contemporaneous writers of the time, an Englishman, came through and saw thousands of shirts being made. But the way the women made it special was that each woman sewed her own name, embroidered her own name onto the shirt, so the soldiers knew that somebody was thinking specially about them. And so that was a very important turning point. And it was written about, again, in all of the newspapers, that their morale was greatly improved because of this effort on the part of the women of America. And then the French showed up. And every so often they show up and do the right thing. And the war was won, and then there was a country to raise. Things then were just as partisan and difficult as they are today, except the country was way too young and way too fragile to withstand it. And the person who was the real heroine there was Dolly Madison, because she was in the new capital of Washington, starting in 1801 as the wife of the Secretary of State, and then on through Madison's own presidency. And then she came back, and she was really the first lady until she died in 1849. And she made everybody come together. She made them break bread together, made them have wine or cider together. And every so often, the Federalists would try to boycott her squeezes, as they were called. And then they'd discover that they were left out of all the political information and the deals. And so they had to come back. And so she really held it together. And then, of course, the British, we had another war with Britain, Mr. Madison's War, for which there was not one Federalist vote. People think that these partisan votes are something new. And she was in the White House with the British approaching, and Madison was out with his soldiers. And she wrote to her sister, "I can hear the cannons." And then everybody came to her and said, "Dolly, you got to go. The British are coming." And she said, "I will not leave until I've secured the portrait of General Washington." And that happened, and then she did leave. And, of course, the city was torched. The British came in. They stole her portrait since they didn't have Washington's to desecrate. And then they sat down and ate her meal like Goldilocks. And then they torched the White House. But she came back to the city a couple of days later and was very ardent in her support for keeping the Capitol there. So she became a national heroine of just remarkable stature. But so many of these women really were heroines. And at the end of the war, Washington wrote to Annis Boudinot Stockton, who was one of the great poets of the Revolution. He said, "I think you ladies are among the best patriots America can boast. But I think the best compliment came from the enemy." Lord Cornwallis wrote home, "We may destroy all the men in America, and we should still have all we can do to defeat the women." So these are our founding mothers. I know that you'll love getting to know them. Thank you for letting me share them with you today.